This webinar is the second in a series about what it takes for districts to be effective in their practice of inclusive instructional and organizational leadership. I'm Deborah Telfer, Director of the University of Cincinnati's Systems Development and Improvement Center, SDI Center for short. Our center is one of the partners in the TIES project, along with the University of Minnesota, the University of Kentucky, the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, the Arizona Department of Education, and CAST. As its website explains, the TIES Center is the National Technical Assistance Center on Inclusive Practices and Policies. Its purpose is to create sustainable changes in kindergarten through grade 8 school and district educational systems so that students with significant cognitive disabilities can fully engage in the same instructional and non-instructional activities as their general education peers while being instructed in a way that meets individual learning needs. This webinar addresses a critical set of leadership practices that have to do with getting an organization to work well, system-wide learning. Another name for it might be organization-wide learning. Everyone and all departments in the organization, that is the system, need to be learning together and evolving together in order for the organization to work well. The opposite of an organization that works well is one that is dysfunctional. Too many of us have seen what that can look like. If a system isn't engaged in an ongoing process of learning and improving, it's in grave danger of becoming dysfunctional. This slide reviews a critical point made in the first webinar in this series. It concerns the right unit for improvement work. What is that unit? It's the district. Districts are close enough to the work and to the community to plan, implement, and support improvement efforts. Schools are too small, and they are comparatively powerless to leverage the assets needed for systemic improvement. State education agencies are too distant from local actors and actions to make improvement efforts stick. Worse still, in terms of moving an organization beyond the status quo, they are regulatory bodies. They take point, as they must, on external accountability and statutory compliance. So it's harder for SEAs to cultivate the kind of internal accountability that is needed for sustained educational improvement. But SEAs can support districts in making and sustaining meaningful improvements. They do so by supporting shared work on the improvement of instructional practice and achievement, promoting a culture of shared accountability, and providing consistent structures for helping people put essential practices in place at all levels of the system. System-wide learning on behalf of systems improvement differs dramatically from compliance-based improvement. For starters, it's more inventive. Its focus is on local needs and aspirations rather than on a one-size-fits-all or cookie-cutter model. It's about what we owe our children, our families, and our community. System-wide learning encourages the organization to act smarter on behalf of all children. When it's done well, it empowers everyone in the organization to take responsibility for the whole system as well as for their particular roles in the system. At this point, your group might find it helpful to pause the video briefly and discuss the questions on the screen. In your experience of your current organization, whether district, regional service provider, or SEA, what do the professional members with lower levels of power and authority, for example, teachers, paraprofessionals, know about the system? What do these professionals need to learn and why? Your group's answers may vary, especially if you are all from different sorts of organizations. System-wide learning, though, is founded on the use of 4 strategic practices with a strong basis in research. They are: 1. Using focused improvement strategies. 2. Using data wisely. 3. Relying on evidence-based instructional practices. And 4. Engaging in systematic and collaborative inquiry. We'll look at each of these in turn after a very quick look at the research footprint for these 4 practices. Here's the mantra: focus strategies, wise data use, evidence-based practices, and collaborative inquiry. Easy to say, hard to do. The practices are presented separately, but they work together, and what happens with respect to one of them ends up influencing all the others. Educational improvement has been a professional concern for as long as there's been an education profession, 100 years or even longer. And much earlier than that, philosophers talked about it. But actual fixes to the system began to take place soon after the system was in place. These fixes are things we now recognize and take for granted. Many of these fixes were, in fact, very successful. The establishment of schools and districts and state education agencies. The fixes systematized American schooling. As the end of the 20th century approached, these fixes were, in fact, well entrenched, and by that time, it was natural for thinkers and researchers to address the system as a whole. It was a decidedly new way to think about educational improvement. This way of thinking, though, isn't about one best solutions, but rather about local responsiveness, accountability to one another, and mindful leadership of the whole enterprise. The quotes on the slide illustrate this newer sort of thinking. We'll unpack those quotes next. Too often, reforms come from the top to the bottom, that is, from central leadership to the classroom teacher. And often, these top-down reforms don't work. Why? First, few at the bottom, where the real work of schooling takes place, understand the major ideas guiding the reform. District leadership, of course, can and should catalyze and guide the reform. But the reform the district supports must be understood clearly and broadly, and it must be embraced by those who implement it. A second reason that top-down only reforms don't work well is that the teachers and others who are supposed to implement the reform haven't joined district leaders in efforts to think about the problems the reform addresses. And of course, third, the implementers have not helped decide how to address the problems. The emphasis in the Spillane and Thompson passage is on the ideas involved. Useful reforms embed ideas about teaching and learning. So how can teachers and others who work with children use these ideas unless they make them their own? Spillane and Thompson aren't talking about how to do an improvement. They're talking about understanding what it really means. When everyone understands the reform, the improvement process benefits from what many see as optimal, a combined top-down and bottom-up approach. Russell Ackoff was a leadership consultant and theorist who didn't suffer fools gladly. His famous F-laws are the result of a lifetime of work with organizations. They explain how organizations mess things up, but with a lot of wisdom about how to push back against the mess. In this F-law, number 38, the point is who does what to whom. And on this basis, leadership isn't mysterious. It's pushback against incompetent administration and management, and it works to make organizations better when it actually exists. And leadership actually exists only when those to whom things are done decide why to do something, what to do, and how to do it. You might say that for Ackoff, system-wide learning is the foundation of leadership. Without it, the organization is clueless. Using means developing and monitoring implementation of the focused improvement strategies. First, the focus in play here means a small number, 3 or 4 at most. Without focus, the organization has to deal with a lot of counterproductive noise. Many districts suffer from having too many improvement initiatives running at once. Second, full implementation across the system is the plan. Everyone needs to understand what that means. Third, monitoring requires development and systematic use of a small set of district-wide formative indicators. Otherwise, monitoring won't happen. Fourth, classroom practices need to align with the improvement strategies, and district leadership needs to plan for that alignment, guide it, and monitor it. Finally, these strategies aren't off-the-shelf products. The district needs to invent them to fit its own circumstances. At this point, your group might find it helpful to pause the video briefly and discuss the questions on the screen. What are the implications of focus for large school districts? For instance, districts with 25 or more schools, as compared to small districts, for instance, 5 or fewer schools. What assets might larger districts bring to the work? What assets might smaller districts bring to the work? What might be the challenges that districts of different sizes face? Michael Folan, who has studied ways to bring improvement strategies to scale, applies the idea of focus to state and national systems as a whole. So, he believes the principle of focus is independent of scale. Nevertheless, he also acknowledges that improvement is more complicated and takes longer in larger systems. Small districts, however, often have fewer resources to help them with improvement efforts, and sometimes their traditional ways of doing things are very well entrenched. Larger systems are often more bureaucratic than smaller ones, so they often favor specialization over flexibility. That circumstance makes it easier to implement certain improvements, such as those requiring higher levels of content expertise among teachers, but it makes it harder to implement other improvements, such as those requiring greater functional integration and collaboration across assigned roles, like the role of general education teacher and the role of special education teacher. Thinking about school improvement strategies usually starts with collecting and analyzing data that reveal district needs, but that's just the beginning. To use data well as a system, all parts of the system need to learn to use data well. Leadership needs to set expectations for data use across the system, and it needs to ensure that everyone in the system understands how to collect, analyze, and interpret data. Using data to guide decision-making depends on these understandings, and data-based decision-making is also a skill set unto itself. A lot of learning across the system is needed in order for everyone to get to the point of using data well. In all of this, educators must understand that data includes information from interviews, observations, and surveys, and such data might be gathered from teachers, leadership teams, parents, community members, or students, or from a combination of groups. So using data wisely involves much more than looking at test scores of various sorts purporting to represent student learning. Equally important, efforts to gather, analyze, and present data must be carefully planned and executed. Too often, data are used to punish people, not to empower them. There are several applicable principles. The first is this: garbage in, garbage out. Poor data cannot be used wisely. The second is, even good data can be used badly. Using data primarily for compliance purposes is a bad idea, according to Michael Folan. Such use undermines organizational capacity, organizational learning, and educational improvement. The third principle says that using data wisely builds capacity. It does so by supporting system-wide learning, focusing attention on what really has an impact, and improving the quality of decision-making. In our ordinary private lives, most of us don't use data in the same way as effective organizations do. Instead, we use conversations. We talk with one another about the things we experience and think about, and we use our conversations with family members and friends to make sense of things. At this point, your group might find it helpful to pause the video briefly and discuss the questions on the screen. In what ways is using data wisely a lot like having good conversations with family members or friends? What kinds of data might support meaningful instructional conversations among teams of teachers? What kinds of data might support meaningful capacity-building conversations among members of school leadership teams? What kinds of data might support meaningful strategy conversations among members of district leadership teams? Some researchers actually do regard research as something like a conversation. Most findings aren't black and white, but come in shades of gray. They apply differently in different places and benefit from drilled-down efforts to study how they can best be implemented in particular classrooms, schools, and districts. A relatively new set of techniques in the fields of improvement science and implementation science can help districts expand data-focused conversations on inclusive and evidence-based instructional practices, system-wide capacity building, and systematic improvement strategies. Improvement strategies typically involve changes in classroom practice, what teachers and students actually do in the name of learning. Surely, it makes sense that such activity be supported by evidence. Published studies, research syntheses, and meta-analyses provide guidance to educators about which instructional practices are effective and under what circumstances. State and federal clearinghouses, like the What Works Clearinghouse, disseminate reviews of instructional programs, and nonprofit organizations like Ed Reports share ratings of instructional materials. Looking at these sources of published evidence is important, but it's not enough. To ensure coherence, the district leadership team needs to calibrate evidence-based practices to system-wide improvement strategies. The practices must be ones that support the strategies. For instance, if effective use of formative assessment is a strategy, then finding classroom grading practices that match the strategy would be especially important. And once evidence-based practices are implemented, it's important to monitor student progress as well as district, school, and teacher team decisions about the implementation of instructional practices. Some additional steps are also critical. Across the system, leadership teams need to use assessment results, especially formative feedback from progress monitoring, short cycle assessments, and benchmark assessments to inform instruction. They need to make mid-course corrections in their use of agreed-upon practices if those practices are not working optimally. And the district needs to engage everyone in using data in these ways. Finally, the district needs to ensure that efforts to measure impact rely on the consistent use of rigorous procedures. The first three practices should have made it clear that a foundation of system-wide learning is a kind of widely shared conversation about what is good for all students, as well as their families, their teachers, and the district and its schools overall. Inquiry provides the basis for the conversation, and it has to be collaborative. It's a project for all the district's educators. There are different roles, certainly, but the common good of the system, for the benefit of the learning of all students, is the point. For a whole system to get this point, the effort has to be systemic, regular, thoroughgoing, wide in scope, and deep. Above all, inquiry requires that educators ask questions, sometimes difficult questions. How they frame those questions and the answers they surface with data lead to decisions that can make the system good for all students, good for just some students, or mediocre or even toxic for most students. Inquiry depends on an organizational culture in which everyone is asking good questions and working on good answers. Dispositions of openness, tolerance for ambiguity, and forthrightness support and are in turn supported by a culture of collaborative inquiry. At this point, your group might find it helpful to pause the video briefly and discuss the questions on the screen. What, in your experience, are the challenges associated with efforts to create a culture of inquiry in K-12 schools? How have you personally experienced these challenges? What, in your experience, are the enablers associated with efforts to create a culture of inquiry in K-12 schools? How have you personally experienced these enablers? Not long ago, schools simply housed teachers who conducted classes for students. Principals managed the building and did the paperwork. Teachers gave quizzes and tests in order to assign grades. Children who did not do well on these quizzes and tests were tested further and placed, often isolated, in separate special programs. The system was being made bit by bit with guidance from state education administrators who typically had experience in big cities and big suburbs. Few others even saw the system. Parts of that culture still prevail in contemporary schools, and learning to see the system remains a challenge for many educators. Systematic and systemic inquiry as a collaborative project is still a very new experience for many educators. This work of seeing, improving, and guiding the system requires system-wide learning over the long term. Who is responsible for seeing and improving the system? Who is responsible for improving the focus, capacity, operations, and accomplishment of districts? It's the people in the district, notably the leadership teams, however they may be defined. One can fix the parts forever without ever seeing the system or addressing its improvement. For improvement to take root, for capacity to grow, the spirit of inquiry and collaboration needs to be cultivated. Inquiry, grounded in good questions, good data, and collaborative decision-making, has to flourish. It can't happen here and there, or in an isolated individual or team. It has to be seen as the way we do things here. The next webinars in this series will explore additional features of this outlook. Finally, here's a brief reminder of the main points in this webinar. First, system-wide learning involves 4 major practices. These are 1, using focused improvement strategies, 2, using data wisely, 3, relying on evidence-based instructional practices, and 4, engaging in systematic and collaborative inquiry. Second, system-wide learning involves a cultural change in many districts, and cultural change is labor-intensive, time-intensive, and sometimes painful. Finally, it's a challenge in all districts to establish and then sustain the norms, structures, procedures, and routines that support the collaborative inquiry needed for system-wide learning.